Guyana to the world.
Globespan is a Guyanese dialogue moving towards the realization of one nation in one Guyana. It's a platform that offers an all-inclusive discussion with the pros, the cons, the ones that is taken aside, and the ones that stand in the middle. Globespan believes agreeing and disagreeing are part of the nation's building.
She is a beauty, beautiful Guyana, with wonderful people all over this country.
Globespan believes every Guyanese voice is part of the nation's building. As we span the globe for voices from the diaspora and those living home, we stand on our commitment that we are all Guyanese working towards one nation in one Guyana. As the world turns on its axis bringing changes, we as Guyanese must adapt to those changes for a better Guyana for all. Globespan stands on its axis with its belief that one nation, one Guyana, one destiny must include voices from all corners of Guyana.
With many flavors, 6 different people blended together. Raise your flag high in unity, we're family with one destiny. Raise your flag high in unity, we're
Good evening and welcome to tonight's edition of Globespan. My name is Rusat Ramgopal. I'll be your moderator for this evening. We will be focusing on the Venezuela elections, the ongoing crisis, and what the updates mean for both Guyana and the U.S. in the region. Tonight, for our panel, we are joined by the esteemed Mr. Timothy Jonas, Senior Counsel, G.H.K. Lal, who you all know as a longtime political analyst and writer in Guyana, and later we will be joined by Mr. Paul King, a U.S. congressional nominee. So without further ado, I will take some opening remarks from our panelists that are with us in the meantime, and then we will go more in depth as the evening goes on. Mr. Jonas and Mr. Lal, I will start with Mr. Jonas for your opening remarks.
Thanks, Rusat. This is on the question of the Venezuelan elections.
Yes, and what in general, your opening remarks, what do you think it means for Guyana?
I think that Venezuela is so large and so immediate to us that anything that happens there will have consequences here. We went into those elections, or we saw them going into those elections, fully aware that President Maduro needed the Guyana aspect of his campaign to be front and center if he was to have a chance. So he was spinning a lot and using the claim on Guyana to try to galvanize support in Venezuela. I don't think it was successful. Things are just too badly off there. But we've seen it. When the Venezuelan economy is in trouble, we have seen Venezuelans coming here and migrating here in large numbers, and our economy and society is small and shaky enough that any impact like that is something we have to think about very, very carefully. We know the sovereign threat that exists. We have to keep a very close eye on what's going on.
Thank you, Mr. Jonas. Mr. Lal, your opening remarks.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for being here. Anything that happens in Venezuela and at that level where Mr. Maduro is so engaged and embroiled, where it's a matter of elections, he stays or he goes, clearly we have to be alert to every development. So I endorse Mr. Jonas's thoughts shared there a moment ago. And given the controversies swirling over this election, and I think some lines are hardening on Maduro's side, on the opposition side, Maria Corina, Edmundo Gonzalez. Well, really, he's a proxy, but on their side. And I think the U.S., the West is marshaling, is thinking through and has arrived at a place that something is going to have to give here. Whether Maduro stays or goes, that's up in the air. We here are in the sensitive position like Mexico. Mexico, when the United States sneezes, Mexico catches a cold. Venezuela is so close, we are not reading about what's going on in Afghanistan and elections there, or Syria, or somewhere way across the world. We're not reading news. We are part of that news because of our proximity to Venezuela. So every development there has some meaning, some significance for us. And I think we need to bear that in mind. We need to bear in mind also that CARICOM itself has been muted. I can't even say it's been hedging. It's been muted, and we really don't know where it stands, as if I'm correct, as of right now. We know where the Dr. Gonzalez is, and that's not unexpected, and where Mr. Maduro is, and that's not unexpected also. We've got really to manage ourselves here and to be alert. He's got lots of assets, military assets, right across from our border. And if he needs a distraction, he can manufacture a provocation here. So I think we need to really have our eyes on and be on top of everything that goes on. Well, as close to it as we can.
Thank you, Mr. Lal. And we were showing just now in images of the massive protests in Venezuela following the election. Those protests were led by the opposition. So we'll put up for context also some of the results that have been reported. So for those who haven't been following, obviously the election was held in Venezuela recently. The Maduro government has put out their results, but the opposition has also put out their results that are actually backed up by detailed tallies. So what you see on the screen right now is the result that's been released by the opposition that shows the detailed tallies, from the states and regions of Venezuela, and those tallies show the opposition candidate Gonzalez with about 67% of the vote, and Mr. Maduro losing with about 30% of the vote. However, Mr. Maduro is staying in power, and these are the official results that his government has released. The CNE, the elections authorities there, have released under him, showing him winning 51 to 42, and he's trying to stay in power with those results. Devin, if you could show the global map. The majority of the world has rejected the results released by Maduro. He's been asked to show the detailed tallies that the opposition has been able to show. He's not releasing any detailed tallies showing the specific votes from the specific regions. And I think that our Guyanese listeners would be reminded, and I think Mr. Jonas, I will take his input just now on it, certain similarities to the 2020 elections process in Guyana. In 2020, you had a government that was trying to remain in power, and they initially released certain claimed results, but the opposition figures were able to say, no, these are the detailed results with the statement of polls, and by keeping up that pressure, which I'll let Mr. Jonas continue on. Eventually, as we all know how history turned out there, the government eventually had to stand down, and a transition of power had to occur. But I wonder, Mr. Jonas, are you seeing any of those similarities in the Venezuela election dispute to what happened in Guyana in 2020?
It's true that there's nothing new under the sun, because since democracy was invented, and since we began to talk about equality and liberty and justice back in the 1700s, people have been trying to find a way to rig elections. Now, in Venezuela, they have an electoral system that is very similar to ours. They have an election council, an electoral council, which is responsible for the management of the elections and is obligated under their legislation. Now, forgive me, I don't speak Spanish. I never read their legislation, so I'm taking my information from news outlets. So please take what I say with a pinch of salt, unlike our election where I did read the legislation. So they have an electoral council, and the council is obligated to publish for everyone to see the result of the ballot count at each polling station. Now, I'm sure that has a ring of familiarity. The Electoral Council is supposed to, let me use Guyana language, at each place of poll, publish for everyone to see, show them the statement of poll. And they did not do that. What they did is they claimed to have collated and calculated the total votes from those statements of poll and to have published that Maduro has won 51% of the votes. Now, I was taken with the similarity of their system, and I was also taken with the similarity of the threats, the means by which the system could be undermined, but also how immediately transparent and obvious that was. If it is true that the elections council, the electoral council, has not publicly held up the statements of poll for everybody to see as part of their tabulation process, you have to have serious concerns. Now, where we go from there, I don't know. You see, you've just shown a map of the globe, and every country is sovereign, and we hear the winner or the party in power or the party that has force of arms at every disputed elections say to the rest of the world, this is none of your business, we are sovereign power, and we can handle our own affairs. You hear that every single time, and then the party that is weak and does not have force of arms is asking the foreign powers to intervene to ensure that there's a fair election. I don't know where Venezuela will go. We certainly could not have moved forward without intervention from the Americans, the Canadians, the English, the CARICOM folk, and everybody else. But Venezuela is not Guyana. Venezuela is a large country with a formidable armed force and is powerful in its own right. So I don't know what the dynamics are there, and I think it's something we have to be concerned about.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Jones. Devin, if you could put up the map again, because I'll make a point and ask Mr. Lal the next question. So Mr. Lal and I were talking earlier before the program started about how there's sort of big power influence in the way this situation will evolve. And if one was to look at the map, you'd see, so the countries in red have rejected the results as claimed by Maduro. The countries in green have accepted the results as claimed by Maduro. As you can see, a majority of the Western countries, along with the United States and Canada, and a lot of the Latin American countries as well, have rejected the Maduro claim results. However, you have Russia, Iran, China, and some countries in that part of the world accepting Maduro's claims and results. Interestingly, if you look at the Caribbean region, you will see a bit of a mix of red and green. So some of the Caribbean countries, for instance, Dominica and St. Vincent and the Grenadines, have actually congratulated Maduro on the results and wished him well, and they still look forward to working with him, which is interesting because Ralph Gonzalez, the Prime Minister of St. Vincent, was the one who was helping to mediate between Guyana and Venezuela just a few months back when that crisis was developing. So that is something to look at there. But I will ask Mr. Lal, what do you think of the international reaction to it? We were talking earlier about how this breaks down the global power dynamics, the West versus Russia and China, and how that deals with Venezuela there. But also in terms of, you were also alluding earlier to CARICOM and how they've been a bit muted so far in terms of their response. And even regionally, you look at the OAS tried to do a resolution on the matter, but the resolution failed because they needed 18 states to vote on it, and they only had 17 in the end because you had a lot either just be abstain or be absent, whether it's Brazil or Trinidad or others. Mr. Lal, so the question to you is, what do you make so far of the foreign reaction and what that means going forward?
Well, thank you. We've got some very definitive postures, and we've got some hedges. Let's look at those who are for. Russia, China, and Iran. They've come out and said, and I think Cuba is somewhere there, they've come out and said elections are transparent, and as far as they're concerned, it's over. in Latin America, Brazil is hedging. Brazil is calling for a transparency and verification. It's joined by Mexico and I think Colombia. Bolivia, Ecuador, and Peru have said this thing, Maduro didn't win. But Brazil is the powerhouse around here. You mentioned about Dr. Gonzalez and the St. Vincent Grenadines, and I think Dominica Roosevelt Skerritt, do I have that right?
Yes.
He come out and said, yes, Maduro is the man. Now, CARICOM itself is caught here, because here is the current chairman has said, well, there's something about, you've got to understand there's something called verification, and I don't think he was very terse. So I am seeing this as playing out this way. The Eastern countries, Russia, China, Iran, they all have major competitive forces at work with the Western world, particularly America, are saying that Maduro has won and this thing is done, let's move along. Russia has positioned some of its fleet here or close to here. China has major tens of billions. I think the last count was about 67 billion US dollars. It's got to be more now. That's a huge financial footprint in Venezuela. And Iran, it just doesn't like to hear the name of the United States of America, and I think it's got its reasons. And the US, Canada, the UK, the EU, and the G7 have taken the opposite tack. This thing, we need transparency. The gap is too big, it's too huge. I heard 70%, then I'm now hearing 80%, the opposition won. The map or the graphs that you put up, the table that you put up showed that there's a 14%, 51 for Maduro, 65. We're not talking about something as thin as Guyana, gentlemen. Folks listening, we're not talking about a couple of thousand votes here. We're talking about we're talking 14 percentage points. And I want to go back to something so I see the ground is ripe for I don't want to say showdown, but for a big power setup, and it's gathering here. I do not think that the US can turn its back and be benign here. I do not think that either side can back away. My problem is that Guyana is so close, and this is what our opening remarks were focused on. Now, I want to go back and extend a little bit on what Mr. Jonas spoke about. Statement of polls and so on and so forth. In Venezuela, they have this thing called the tally sheet. And the tally sheet, I understand, can be feet long, several feet long. Think of a supermarket receipt. Think of a department store receipt. So that's a record of the votes. I don't know how cumbersome this thing is, but for every polling station, despite the presence of the military and the militia and Maduro and Chavistas people, the opposition were able to get tens of thousands of people across Venezuela. They were preparing for this for months, and they were able to obtain those tally sheets, and that's what they're basing this claim that we have won, and not by any slim margin. We have won convincingly, and we have won by a massive differential. So I think if I have to make a call now, I will say that Maduro lost the election. As to where it's going to go, we really don't know at this point. He's too far in to turn back. He's too far in to step back kindly or peacefully. And so I think, again, we always must come back to what are the implications here? What are the ramifications for this country of, 800,000 people? An army that is there and not there, and a country that's divided, a country that's still debating elections in the courts, and we've got a fraud case coming up now, and there's controversy about that. So we've got our work cut out here for us, and either way that this turns out, I think I've said this before on this program and other programs, that whether Maduro wins or withdraws, we've got the bar that he has set, because the opposition, it may kind of soft pedal or back burner. And I'm using American verbs here, so excuse me. They cannot really step back too far from the line that he has drawn in terms of the border situation, and that played such a big role in this election year. So anything that happens there comes back to this: big power intervention, no power intervention. Maduro wins, Maduro withdraws, the opposition step forward. The opposition to Guyana is too close for comfort, too close for my comfort.
Yes, 100%. I agree, and I've used this example before when talking about Venezuela on this program. But when you were saying just now, it reminded me again. Guyana is a very small country, right? And when you have a madman next door with a big country, the reason you always have to be afraid and pay attention to what's going on there. If you look back over the years, that's one of the reasons Kuwait had to pay attention to what Saddam Hussein was doing, because when you have a madman with a large army at his disposal in charge of a large state like Saddam was in Iraq, and I think that Maduro is almost a modern day equivalent of that in some ways. A madman just trying to hold on in any way he can. The neighbors have to always be paying attention to what goes on there. But you were saying just now, we don't know what will happen, and we have to be prepared for what happens either way there. And one of the things that probably will happen, no matter what ends up being the end result in Venezuela, is Venezuela's been there's been a lot of refugees coming from Venezuela in the past few years to other countries in the region, Guyana, Trinidad, and the U.S. in particular. So on that note, I'll also bring in, we have Mr. Paul King waiting to join. He is a congressional nominee in the U.S., and that way we will also talk about the migrant impact of the discussion and what that means for both Guyana and the U.S., because both countries have to deal with what happens as a result in Venezuela in terms of the influx of migrants that will likely happen. Devin, if you could put up some of the charts that I sent you, you could put up the regional one with all the countries and by Venezuela. I'll show what I'm talking about. So this is, over the past few years, how many refugees from Venezuela estimated have had to enter other countries. Estimated refugees and migrants in 2024, or the most recent year available. So you could see 22,000 to Guyana in 2024, 36,000 to Trinidad. So this has a very big impact on the neighboring countries like Guyana. And if you could put up the chart I showed you with the New York City migration, Venezuela is the top country for the migration to New York City right now. So this issue unites across both Venezuela and the U.S. and New York in particular, where both of our audiences are. We have an audience based in Guyana. We also have a large New York audience as well in the diaspora. So this is an issue that I figured our panel will be well versed to talk about. We have U.S. congressional nominee, we have a leader of a third party in Guyana, and we have a stalwart Guyanese political analyst to talk about what that means for these countries. So, Mr. King, I'll give you a chance to give some of your opening remarks in joining us and talk about what you think the Venezuela crisis means in relation to the New York migrant situation. Oh, I think you're on mute. Yeah, and in the meantime, I'll note also.
How are we doing now?
Yeah, oh, yes, very good. And I'll note, obviously, Mr. King is a nominee for U.S. Congress. The U.S. Congress has to deal with foreign policy issues like, crises in the region, like Venezuela. And Mr. King's opponent is Gregory Meeks, who is the leader of House Foreign Affairs for the Democrats. So we will talk about what that means for U.S. foreign policy and the Venezuela elections as well. Mr. King, your opening remarks and joining us. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Rusat, and thank you, gentlemen. I apologize. I really struggled with the technology even before the microphone, but I finally got us going. So I didn't have the benefit of hearing everything you said. I came on, I was on and off. Mr. Jonas was talking about how, every time there's a disputed election, the people who win, it's usually the people who are already in power. It's very rarely the people who are trying to attain power that win a disputed election. They say there's nothing to say here. And, it almost feels like a Cold War type incident, because you've got people who don't like the U.S. lining up on one side, and people who are aligned with us on the other. So it's easy for someone to be cynical and saying, well, does anyone care about the truth? I agree with Mr. Law. I think this election stinks to high heaven, and it's not shocking. A guy like Maduro is not going to give up power very easily, and that's just the sad truth in many places in the world. As far as the impact here in the United States, and I think, as your diagram shows, huge impact on Colombia and closer neighbors. I think, part of what the U.S. should try to do is support those immediate neighbors, because, as taking a lead in saying, okay, we want to isolate Venezuela for Maduro's bad acts and other things, we know that's going to have spillover effects to our other friendly countries in the region. So we should do what we can to help them in the short term and frankly, in the long term with better partnerships. As for the direct impact here in New York, as you said, Rusat, we've had, that's the leading source of migrants in this current surge that we've been struggling with in New York. And we've had Venezuelan immigrants for a long time. There's quite a vibrant Venezuelan community on the outskirts of Miami. And, they do very well, pursuing their American dream, just like any other immigrant from any other part of the globe. But, the current situation in New York, as, Rusat's aware, he also lives here in Queens with me, is we're inundated with these temporary camps that are temporary, but there's no end in sight. So the impact on the people who live there, the people impact on people who need services from New York City is terrible. So we're just sort of importing a headache, and no one in New York State, and certainly no one who's currently in power in DC, seems to have any solution, any end game, for the specific problem in Venezuela, which certainly got worse with the election, and with the ongoing challenges that we have with our southern border. So I'll pause there.
Yes, and in terms of New York City's handling of the migrant crisis, for our New York audience who would be aware of what we're talking about, there was even a comptroller's report today from the New York comptroller that put out about how much unnecessary spending was done in handling the migrant crisis. And look, it's a hard thing to handle a migrant crisis when you're in government, whether it's in New York or Guyana, and we'll talk about that more later. But I think one of the criticisms ends up being the unnecessary spending that takes place as a result. But Mr. King, you're running for Congress. If you end up being a member of Congress, just like the current incumbent congressman in the area, Mr. Meeks, you would have a significant role to play in foreign policy. And I wonder if you could talk about what do you think of the current U.S. foreign policy towards Venezuela that individuals like Mr. Meeks are involved in, and what you think the potential changes in U.S. policy towards Venezuela should be, especially as we approach the elections, and whichever party wins in the U.S. could have an impact on a change in policy.
Okay. Well, I think that Mr. Meeks likes to use the word multilateralism quite a bit, and I don't object to the concept, but it's really the execution. If you're the United States and you have all the assets that we have to address any particular situation, multilateralism should come with strong American leadership, which is bringing everyone along, but it can't be, we're going to be more accommodating, and particularly in the case of Gregory Meeks and the Democrats, I feel like they've been trying to be more accommodating to Maduro. Meeks has a relationship with him going back quite a ways, since before Maduro ascended to the top, and he was pushing hard here, to give him more carrots, thinking that would change things, reduce sanctions and such. And I don't think that, with a player, the bad actor like that carrots work very well. I don't think it should be complete confrontation. You don't need to make taking a hard line of saying we don't want to deal with you, do business with you, be necessarily a road to war. I think that's a false argument we run into a lot in the United States. If you're not appeasing the Russians back in the 80s, or some of the bad actors in the Middle East in the 90s, that means you're by default want to go to war. I think you could take a harder line, and we need to take a harder line and realize we're not going to go in there and change the leadership in Venezuela, period. That has to come from inside Venezuela. We should do our part as good neighbors to help our neighbors in Central and South America who are affected by the current crisis.
Yes, and it's interesting that you said at the end there that we will not be the ones to change that. Because if we look back at U.S. foreign policy over the past 20 plus years, if we're having this conversation about 20 years ago, I think the discussion would be very different. The Bush administration, for instance, actually very much wanted to change the administration in Venezuela, and had talked about going in against Hugo Chavez at one time. And I wonder if there's, especially after what's gone on in the Middle East in the past 20 years, that leads to a change in U.S. foreign policy, that the U.S. is much more hesitant to support regime change as much as it once did. But it also leads to discussion, as you're mentioning, Meeks and Biden were pursuing certain talks with Maduro. I think that there is in terms of which party's in power in Washington, a difference in how Venezuela is handled. Whether one's a Republican or Democrat, I think one could agree that when Bush and Trump were in power, the Republicans had a lot more focus on Venezuela and talks about removing Chavez or trying to oust Maduro, whereas the Democrats don't really have that intention. They want to talk with them, potentially ease sanctions, have this in exchange in return. I saw Mr. Jonas have a little bit of eyebrow raise just now. It happened. So many things happen that people forget about it. But in 2018-19, at one time, Trump was talking about trying to replace Maduro, especially when he was promoting Juan Guaido. So some people may remember that when you reference it. But so much has happened since then that it's easy to forget it. But we were mentioning Mr. Meeks. We have the statement. Meeks has put out a statement, and that's largely been the response so far from the American officials, whether it's Blinken or Meeks, is they have just put out a statement condemning the result of this or that, but not really much of a stronger, clearer stance than that. Devin, if you could put up the two pieces I sent you of Meeks' statement.
While you're putting that up, may I add, and maybe I read this wrong, but I was kind of stunned by this. The new Democratic candidate for Congress, Vice President Harris, her initial response was along the lines of, well, we have to respect the results of an election. We're going to work hard for, better democracy in the future. She seemed to be saying, it is what it is. Let's just move forward. It's like she didn't get the memo that a lot of people thought that there was a real problem with the results.
Yeah. So we have the statement for Meeks up, and he is expressing concern about the results and urges for the independently validated results to be expeditiously published by the Venezuelan authorities, and especially concern over the humanitarian crisis. He also condemns the quote ongoing harassment of the political opposition in the country, and Devin, if you could put the second part up, he also claims that Maduro is not acting in spirit of the agreement that they had agreed to last year in Barbados. And the reason that I mentioned that, I'll open it up to all members of the panel. I was trying to give Mr. King some time since he joined in just now. But I wonder if the U.S. response may be viewed a bit differently due to the fact that domestically, when one looks at that statement by Meeks that he's concerned about ongoing harassment of the political opposition, I think that the fact that in the U.S. right now you do have both parties when they're in power actually try to harass their political opposition in ways that they didn't a long time ago. You do have political prosecution in the U.S. in ways that you didn't have as we were saying, like 20 years ago, and the fact that the Biden administration did try to negotiate with Maduro last year, but it seems like they were negotiating with a party that could not be trusted. I wonder how that affects the view of how the U.S. response is so far. I'll start with Mr. Lal. What do you think of the U.S. response? Do you think it shows a sort of weakness that the Democrat response? Meeks is head of House Foreign Affairs for Democrats. It's basically we tried to negotiate with this guy, and now all of a sudden we're realizing he's not trustworthy. But we're putting out these strong worded statements, but there's not much to back it up. There's not new sanctions or anything like that. and do you think it shows that the U.S. is somewhat weaker than it was, or somewhat more reluctant than it was, at a different point in time to intervene in these types of situations because it's backfired in the past?
I don't like the word weak. I think the U.S. has been muted at the beginning, mild. It has ratcheted up the pressure because it came out. Secretary Blinken came out and said, "We are concerned." And then following that, after several days had passed and things became more obvious as to what has taken place, and I'm sticking to my position that the disparity is too great, not as alleged by the opposition, but as common sense tells me that Maduro lost this election. I'm going to make that call. And I think, and after that, Blinken came out from being concerned, which in diplomatic speak says, there's a little chill here. And then he says, well, the opposition won the election. This is the Secretary of State of the United States of America saying that. Now, I don't think there is any weakness there. I think there may be some disconnect within the Democratic Party, and nominee King, please forgive me for saying that. I'm not going to vote in the Rockaways area, but anyhow, so I think what has to happen here, I remember that President Truman, there was the Truman Doctrine. Hands off Europe, containment of communism in Europe. The Carter Doctrine, we look on the Persian Gulf as any presence there that is threatening as being inimical to U.S. interests. The Bush Doctrine, the Bush the Younger Doctrine, unilateralism and yes, good. Joe Biden has to come out with his doctrine. I mean, it's in the fading years of his presidency, seeing that he's not coming back, but he's got to come out with the Biden doctrine, and it's got to be specific. It's not going to replace the Monroe Doctrine, but he's got to come out and make a statement that draws a line in the sand that we will have to respect, that the United States will respect the voice of the people in their electoral decisions, and that must count. However, that is nuanced. That has got to be, I think, the underpinning here, because I think the U.S. must be commended for giving the openings for allowing the internal processes to bubble up to the top so that the world can see what really has occurred in this election, where Brazil, the Latin American giant, is saying, let there be some transparency, let there be a verification. We talked about the Elections Council, I think it's NCE, and that's controlled by Maduro. And the Supreme Court is controlled by Maduro, so the outcomes of those are all but foregone. And we've had that with the Elections Council. Maduro won. I think what we haven't spoken about yet is the military. The defense minister has come out and said that the military is behind the government. Well, that's only as good as long as it lasts. But the United States, it's in its interest to step up the heat gradually and let there be no mistake as to where it stands on how it has interpreted the results on the ground in Venezuela.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. Just quick follow-up on that. You used a similar word with both the U.S. and CARICOM earlier. Used the phrase muted, right? That there's been certain aspects of a muted response, and I wonder, would you think that the muted response of the U.S. or the regional organizations, CARICOM, or even OAS in certain ways, what that bodes for Guyana in terms, because our discussion is, well, what does this mean for Guyana? Guyana obviously had to deal with Venezuela in this Essequibo crisis recently, and if Guyana had to deal with a similar situation like that with Venezuela in the future, what do you think the message that Guyana should take from that is? Do you still see these organizations as being as reliable as they once were, and potentially coming to the support of Guyana, or does the muting or the muted response lead to any caution or worry?
this might be alien to nominee King, but we are a small country. We are reduced to PNC and PPP. Anybody and everybody can come here and weigh in and sound like an authority on our elections and about transparency and free and fair and democracy and all of those lovely concepts and situations. But we're talking about a bigger election involving a population of about somewhere around 30 million people, a powerful military, a man who is entrenched, and he's got 300 big ones. He's got 300 billion barrels of oil. And so you've got, I'm not surprised at where Gonzalez is, the Convention Prime Minister, and others, because they are looking to say, look, we are with you. So economically, please don't forget us. Guyana now, where we are here, I think, I've always said this, Russia is too far away. The vice president has come out and in his wisdom has said, I am done with these isms, and has replaced them with capitalism, which he's always been about in a different form, and another kind of ism, which I will not mention here. And so in my book, I would prefer a more vibrant American voice in this Venezuelan situation. It was muted at the beginning. It has ratcheted up that somewhat, and I think it's got a ways to go. But things should not go to a boiling point. I think Maduro must be given a way that he can step out gracefully. Whether that is going to happen, whether he's going to even nibble at that, I doubt it. But I think, look, from a Guyanese perspective, from one resident here now, I don't want to hear about Russia. I don't want to hear about China. I don't want to hear about Iran. But we are going to hear about that, whether we like it or not. I want to hear about America. I want to hear what the US of A, where it stands, and how it's going to go about this thing.
Thank you, Mr. Jonas. Yeah, any response to any of the comments so far, and what do you think about the U.S. response, or other responses, and what it means for Guyana?
I used the opportunity while Mr. King and JHK Lal were speaking to do a quick fact check, because my instinct tells me that we shouldn't do comparisons that we're trying to do. First of all, at the international level, it's not about right and wrong, it's about self-interest. So your motive is self-interest, and for most countries, self-interest is economic stability, prosperity of its population, and social stability. Now, when Venezuela goes to shambles, as it has been doing, you see this large migration, and Mr. King spoke about the difficulty New York is having with its immigrant population, the strain on the infrastructure, education, and social, and that kind of thing. But I want to put this in context. Venezuela's population is 20-something million. If you check New York City class population, it says 8 million. But if you take all the boroughs and the surrounds into consideration, the people who live and work there, it's over 20 million. New York City's GDP is $2 trillion. Now, when we say, oh, it's a strain on New York City to have these immigrants and to find jobs and for the infrastructure to support them, that is true, but it is true in a completely different context from when Guyana, with 4% of that population and a minuscule fraction of that economy, with our 700,000 people and our huge open porous border with Venezuela. If we receive 50,000, don't let's go to a million, just 50,000 Venezuelans that come across this border, you are talking 8% of our entire population. And you're talking about those 50,000 people resting on an infrastructure that is already struggling to deal with the needs of the Guyanese population. So the danger is real and immediate, and I don't like the comparison. When you then start to talk about the US policy in its approach to Venezuela and whether it's weak or whether it's strong. Well, again, in the issue of self-interest and the political longevity of its leaders, it's very easy to go and invade Grenada with a couple thousand people on the island. And that is done with the stamp of a finger. It's very different to look at a country like Venezuela and decide how to interfere. That has to be done much more tactfully than Mr. Trump, I think, has shown he's capable of when he talks about getting rid of Maduro. It has to be done in a nuanced conversational way. It has to be done with economic sanctions and with diplomacy. Now, that has worked to an extent because we know Maduro made concessions. They weren't sincere and they weren't kept fine. But that seems to be the way to go. But my larger question, given that we already have several dozen thousand Venezuelans here in Guyana, having come over here through our porous borders, we are unable to stop them. We have seen crime involving Venezuelans. We have heard of incidents in the mining areas in the interior involving Venezuelans. We know that our police force cannot keep up with the Venezuelan population that is here. And we know that culturally, Venezuelans tend to be more militant than we are. Now, what do we do? What is in our self-interest? And what do we learn? What lessons can we learn from what's going on around us? I think that's where the conversation needs to go, because the US is going to act in their self-interest, and they're absolutely right to do so. And they recognize that Russian and Chinese influence, growing as it is in the region, is undesirable for them. And they'll do what they can to stop it. All of that is a conversation not just above my pay grade, but above our entire country's pay grade. We have to think about how we can position ourselves to withstand the economic hardships that are going to happen, to withstand the influx that is already happening, and to ensure that however it plays out in Venezuela, we have some kind of cushion and insulation. There's nothing else for us to do.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Before I ask my follow-up, I just want to clarify. I was never comparing that the two will face it. U.S. and Guyana will face that the impact of the Venezuelan migrant or refugee situation to the same extent. Obviously, as you well pointed out, given the size and proportion of Guyana, the impact and the strain, has a much different extent than it would say in New York City. I was just trying to say that it is an issue that both areas have to deal with, not that the extent to which the areas have to deal with it are the same. Obviously, as you pointed out, the comparison has its limits. But to follow up on what you're saying, dealing directly within Guyana, and to your point that given the population size of Guyana, it does have a very a much more proportionate impact than it does in New York. To what extent do you think Guyana is ready for a further potential influx of refugees and migrants as a result of a potential unrest and how that election situation goes down in Venezuela? And what do you think that also mean for the social ramification? Do you think there'll be much more anti-immigrant or anti-Venezuelan immigrant sentiment in Guyana? You mentioned like the issue of crime. I remember, I think it was last year at this point, when one police car was renamed Policia, that led to a massive uproar. At least online with the netizens in Guyana going that they didn't want to see something like the police car have a Spanish language name instead of the obviously the English police car name. So there'll be a lot of social ramifications if you have much more Venezuelans coming into the area, especially given the population size of Guyana. Just a few thousand more Venezuelans would change the population dynamic a lot, and you'll have much more Spanish speakers in Guyana. So just as a general point, what do you think the social ramifications would mean for Guyana, and is Guyana ready for that?
Is that directed at me?
Yes, sir.
Wow, that's a large question, and the truth is, I've only begun.
A large question for a brilliant mind.
Flattery is not going to help me this time. I'm in trouble. I've only begun to nibble at the edges of that. There's one thing that I have seen. Venezuela's economy is in crisis. Its currency is in shambles. And its currency, as I have heard, is increasingly in gold and US. So our porous borders are a good location for gold to come across here and for at discounted prices, but discounted US prices. So the people in charge there have that avenue in Guyana. And you know, we have heard stories in Guyana of gold not accounted for, gold suddenly turning up, money laundering and that kind of story. So the economics of it, I think, is something we have to be very careful about, because we have an open porous border there where not just gold, but also arms, drugs can come across. We have seen that when there is an embargo on Venezuela and the US does not allow shipping out to Venezuela, I believe that it is much easier for drugs from Colombia to just go across from Venezuela to Guyana, and we see suddenly people become very wealthy in Guyana overnight. So I am very afraid that the side effect of a continued economic ban on Venezuela will be that their currency continues to collapse, their economy continues to collapse. It's not just that the result will be Venezuelans leaving their shores and coming here, which we cannot stop because our borders are so porous, but it is also the serious economic result, the economic consequence that we also cannot control. I worry about that. Insofar as Venezuelans are here, let me tell you, for the last 40 years since we've managed to destroy our own economy, the best and brightest of Guyanese, the educated, the urban, the middle class, the professionals, the academics, have migrated. And it's hard for me, therefore, to say we need to close our borders the best we can. There are a couple things I think need to be important. First of all, we need to welcome who comes on condition that they're obeying our laws, paying our taxes, and are gainfully employed. We need to be much more careful and inflexible that if we catch defaulters, they go back where they come from. So we need to have a clear system of deportation of undesirables. 80% are desirables, 80% are young, able-bodied, hardworking people. It's always the best and the brightest that have to get up and go, to leave and seek new horizons when things get tough where they are. But that also will include a criminal element, and we need to be vigilant to send them back where they came from if they are the criminal element. If we can integrate, if we can use that to ensure that they are paying their taxes, that they're properly employed, we may find that we can weather the storm, because one thing we cannot do is stop them from coming. We are not big enough. They're too big. The numbers are too great. You see a picture of a Venezuelan boat landing at the seawall. What can you do about it? So I think we have to figure out the fight that we can fight and how to fight it and how to make the best of it. But also, we have to lobby in the international community for an end result that is a stable and orderly Venezuela. And the only way to do that, I'm afraid, first of all, we can't be seen to be interfering. We promised we wouldn't. We went and signed a protocol agreement with the Venezuelans in terms of our boundary dispute. But I do believe that the only way Venezuela will become a prosperous and stable member of the international community again is if there is a fair and free democracy. And the commencement of that is free and fair elections. So we have to be lobbying for that.
Thank you, Mr. Jonas. Mr. Lal, I saw your facial expression. You looked like you had wanted to jump in at one point earlier. Is there anything specifically you want to add to the topic we were going on with Mr. Jonas?
You know, we've been talking about migrants here, and I agree with Mr. Jonas in that we must welcome migrants. I'm a migrant myself, so I can identify with that. I can relate to that. So we should welcome Venezuelans. obviously with the distinctions as identified by Mr. Jonas, but I'm concerned about the impact on the social infrastructure. We're talking about known 22,000 Venezuelans. What about the unknowns? Is it 50,000 currently? Is it 70,000? Is it 100,000? Because we hear, Mr. King, Mr. Ram Gopal, we live here and we travel along the East Bank, and there are all these tents on what we call the seashore, the sea dam. There are all these areas, call them barrios, where Venezuelans they live in clusters. So I do not know what's going on in Berbice. I do not know what's going on in Bartica and in Essequibo or further away from Georgetown. But when you add this up, you're talking about probably, highly likely, tens of thousands of Venezuelans that are not officially accounted for. I can tell you this, because I have a government office next door to me, and there's a lot of construction going on, and you can hear the Spanish language working with the Guyanese workers. I have people who are doing construction privately, and they're scattered all over the place. So you want a skilled worker, you get a Venezuelan. The migrant labor is cheaper and it's better and it's more willing. It's more available than the local labor. Just speaking selectively here. Now, don't forget we have oil. Don't forget that our economy is the most talked about, I think I would venture to say, in the world. So that's a magnet. That's a magnet for migrants, for people who are in a depressed state. Their economy is in a depressed state. Their socials, their environment is sort of menacing. So they look for the easiest way out, and it's a short distance to us here. So the impact here, that's what I'm concerned about. We heard Mr. King earlier and about New York and about the influx there. But New York, having been there, it's got a lot of, shall I say, absorbent capacity, even though even that is stretched mightily. We have very little of that capacity, given a budgetary restraints, given our own requirements, schooling, sanitation, drainage, health care. We are having some improvements there, but those can barely cater to us. So when we're talking about tens of thousands, whether it's 22,000 officially or 50,000 or whatever that number is, that is a huge dent. That's a huge demand on our social infrastructure or economics that we really, really can't afford, can't absorb at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Law. Mr. King, I'll bring you back into the discussion. Any points particularly that you want to respond to, and then I'll ask you a follow-up. Oh, I think you're on mute.
2 for 2. Yeah, a question that I don't want answered right now because I have other things to say, but I wonder if the crisis continued, and certainly proportionally impact is much greater on Guyana than even Texas, no less the United States of America. If you run into a problem where somehow Maduro or a future Maduro says that there's so many Venezuelans there, then this changes the whole Essequibo dispute where it's our land. Like the Russians are saying, hey, listen, there's Russians in the Ukraine, and we should be there, making them part of our territory. But before anyone jumps in on that, I really do want to respond to some of the things that were said before. And I'll start by saying with Mr. Jonas, I'm going over my pay grade because, this is more like if I were president, not if I were congressman. Because I do agree, with Mr. Lal that we need, it might not, a new Monroe Doctrine. About how we're going to conduct relations. The United States wants to conduct its relations in the Western Hemisphere, and I would argue to Mr. Jonas that our self-interest should include a stable Western Hemisphere where we have good partners from, the Arctic all the way down to, the tip of Argentina. And so we should be helping our partners as much as we're able to. And that's why I said earlier, I think we should be looking to help Guyana and Colombia, the countries that are right there that are having the most burden proportionally, get through this crisis. But in the meantime, since I'm not going to be elected president this year, I think Mr. Lyle's point is really important, and it's part of our broken politics situation. It's our broken politics in America in general, but specific to what's going on right now, where you have a president who's semi-retired. So we don't know what Mr. Biden thinks they should be doing, and he's not the type that's bold enough to have come up with any sort of doctrine. It's just not his style. His heir apparent sort of, I checked what I said before. She absolutely, her first reaction was, we need to respect, this election. She completely ignored the controversy. And as far as I know, she hasn't said anything. I do agree with maybe both of you who said, I think Mr. Blinken, who I don't always agree with, and I'm a Republican, by the way, not a Democrat, was properly measured in stepping up. We're saying, okay, at first we're concerned. It doesn't make sense to come out screaming it's a cheat. It only makes you look less objective. You need to be measured and move along. And then he stepped it up to the next level, which surprised me. I haven't heard it from anyone else in our government. And around the same time, I actually went on Twitter. I said to Gregory Meeks, I'm like, I saw your initial statement. Days have passed now and the evidence is mounting up. I think it's time to say something more. You need to step it up to the next level. So collectively, we don't have a clear message from the United States of America because the people in charge, the highest ranking Democrat in the Foreign Affairs Committee, the Secretary of State, the President, the Vice President don't seem to be on the same page. So how the heck is anyone else in the world supposed to know what we really think, unless there's some great diplomacy going on in the background? And if there is, I tip my hat to them. I think that's good to do, not to put everything in the papers, but so that's my collective response to what I would like to do, and also what I think part of the problem is right now.
Thank you, Mr. King. To follow up on some points, so you were joking in light that it is above your pay grade, but if you were to win your election, it would be within your pay grade. You would be a member of Congress. So if you were in Congress now, Congressman King, what are some things that you do differently than Congressman Meeks right now in his position? Obviously he put out his statement, but would you be supporting something beyond just the strong statements that we're seeing from the current people in office? Would like if we compare it to certain similar situations when they've happened around the world, you have the congressmen who end up supporting sanctions to pressure a leader that to eventually go out. That has not been done. Well, I mean, they have been sanctions against Maduro. It hasn't been completely effective. Then you've had some sanctions relief as sort of a tit for tat and leverage to get him to the negotiation table. But then also you've had him, as Meeks himself acknowledge, not really act within the spirit of the agreement that he agreed to. So would you want to have a foreign policy pursued where he was engaged in negotiation, or not negotiated with because he's proven himself to be untrustworthy time and time again? And another point is, as you alluded to, President Biden is a lame duck at this point. To what extent do you think the U.S. political situation, instability of sorts, affects the U.S. foreign policy power at this moment?
On the first question, I would like to see a kind of a steady, measured ratcheting up. So yes, if we acknowledge that Maduro hasn't kept his part of the bargain, then we should at least be saying, okay, that means that we don't, that we can bring back sanctions. We could take back, what we were offering. We don't have to leap to it right away, but you say that, give a little time for a reaction. We're not going to get a reaction, but then say, okay, sanctions come back in place. Then we start saying collectively, we bring in the Organization of American States, with the immediate neighbors, and say, what are we collectively going to do about this? So if that's at least the path to be on. I think it's to be pushing harder and harder, isolating again Venezuela, as long as Maduro's in charge. of course, I don't have a solution for what comes next. It's not like someone's going to parachute in and take over. And to be honest with you, I don't know enough about it. Who would be good to take over, but that's not our choice here in the United States. But we just know that it's a bad situation for everyone, especially the Venezuelans. And we moved. You could say, okay, we tried a softer touch. Now it's time to swing back in the other direction. I don't mean wherever we need to put a carrier group ever off of Venezuela, but we at least need to bring back sanctions and say, we're just not going to play ball with you, Maduro, because you're not doing right by your people or your neighbors. And I forgot the second question.
Well, it was starting off with what would you do differently? Whether you would engage with him or not, which I think you got to, and then the other part later on was, you were alluding to the fact that Joe Biden is obviously a lame duck at this point, and to what extent do you think the domestic situation in the U.S., the political instability, in the sense that we're going towards an election, you have a lame duck in office right now, and also with particular regard to the U.S.-Venezuela relationship, you have had Maduro sort of, well, he directly said it at times that some of the developments in the U.S. recently with certain cases going to the Supreme Court or certain politicized trials of political candidates in the U.S. that and also election disputes in the U.S. recently, that you basically don't have the standing to tell me what you think that you have the right to tell me, given what's going on in your own country.
Well, I think we've embarrassed ourselves mightily the last few years on a couple of points, but we've also have hundreds of years of getting it right for the most part. So I think there's some goodwill, and there's nothing going on at the level of what's going on in Venezuela or most of these faux democracies. So we embarrassed ourselves. We'll have a good election this year, and we'll regain. We'll take that argument away from people. Assuming President Trump wins again, which I mean, if I were gambling, I'd bet at least $1 today that he'd win. He's going to need a really good Secretary of State because something that might have been alluded to earlier. He speaks, he shoots from the hip a lot, and he'll say things that worry people, and that ultimately doesn't become his policy. But he's not inherently diplomatic in his approach to these issues. So. And I think it can leave people wondering, what does the United States really think? So I think he needs a really strong Secretary of State to make sure we're communicating effectively when these challenges come up, especially in our own hemisphere.
Thank you, Mr. King. And since I have you here, it's going to be a question not directly related to Venezuela, but it's going to be related to elections. You are obviously running for Congress in New York. New York is in play this year, very much compared to historically speaking. People can see the news and articles about it. New York is expected to be much closer than usual. So your election will potentially be a very key one to pay attention to, and we have a lot of viewers in New York. If you could, for those who are not as familiar with you, even though you've been on before, so hopefully a lot of people do recognize you. Tell us about the area of New York that you're running in, and any related information that you want people to know about the upcoming election.
Well, my district is the southernmost district in New York, so it's the area around JFK Airport. People might recognize that. I live on the Barrier Beach. It's on the south side of Brooklyn and Queens, and my district is basically the southern half of Queens. And it is incredibly diverse and includes a great large Guyanese community. Little Guyana is in my district. And we need the Guyanese people to come out and vote, because traditionally their turnout isn't enough. So we need their voices in the game. But I think what's important about my election, and we'll see what the results are, is that first generation Americans tend to register as Democrats. They don't always vote as Democrats, but they do quite a bit. And I think what I'm seeing is they're seeing a change in the value systems. And I think that we're going to see the old model where the Democrats can just take for granted that newer Americans are just going to vote for them because it's always been that way is different. And I think that's really important for the future of our country, for the first generation, second generation Americans to make their voices heard as strongly as my neighborhood, which probably had double the turnout when I ran 2 years ago, in my neighborhood than in almost any other district in Queens. We need everyone speaking up because most people have the same good values, and this is a way to break the same old cycle. So the Guyanese community is a really big part of that here in Queens and in my district.
Thank you, Mr. King. So, for those who live in Queens, you'll potentially look out for Paul King's name as we approach the elections this year. And as you were saying, we do have a large Guyanese population. It's the Guyanese are the second largest immigrant group in Queens, but they don't necessarily always take full advantage of their voting potential and come out. So hopefully they become more engaged in the voting process and they end up to show their full power. In my involvement in politics in New York, I used to compare the Guyanese population that I used to use the David and Goliath reference that we're David, we could take on Goliath, but somebody actually pointed out, no, they're Goliath. They're a massive population, but they just don't turn out. But hopefully, if they do turn out, they can have a huge impact in politics in the U.S. as well. Now, on a lighter note, since we're discussing elections and not just Venezuela at this moment, when we're preparing for this program tonight, I saw people commenting on Facebook or WhatsApp or whatever, and I saw some people commenting that they wanted the panel to talk about the ongoing elections case in Guyana. Now that was not what we were planning to talk about tonight. We're planning to talk about Venezuela, but since I have an esteemed senior counsel on tonight, I said I would ask one question before we end. Mr. Jonas, do you have any comment or thoughts on the case going on right now in Guyana? Sorry, you're on mute.
There are a number of them going on.
Obviously, I try to be more specific. The most recent prosecution of the three officials brought by the special prosecutor, Darshan Ramdani.
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to comment about merits or demerits, as you will expect.
Yeah.
And I am disappointed that actual trial has not started until 2024. This is 4 years later. I also have some reservations. I read in the papers that the magistrate had requested that evidence be given of the electoral system. Now, I would have thought that was obvious, and I would have thought that should have been the starting point, that an expert witness goes in to explain how the system works, so that when the evidence comes up as to if and how that system was not observed, it is clear. So I hope that is done thoroughly. I also have a view that when you're given evidence, you try to distill and clarify it as much as possible with as few witnesses as possible. I hope that that's what's being done. I wouldn't like to see 20 or 30 witnesses being presented. I hope that it's done in a sanitized, distilled way so that the necessary facts are brought out. But again, I don't know. I do know we're 1 year away from another election that might make the whole thing academic, but time will tell.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. And Mr. Lal, as our esteemed Guyanese political analyst on the panel, I'll give you a chance. Did you have any remarks or quick remarks on that topic?
I think we shouldn't have been speaking about the 2020 elections and who was involved and who did what at this stage, 4 years later. This matter should have been dealt with, done with, and be over, a long time ago. As Mr. Jonas just said, we are within striking distance of the next elections, and we are still bogged down with the last one. Something is wrong with us, and I'm thinking, as I see what is happening in the realms of jurisprudence, that is this deja vu? Are we going backwards? Are we going to have a repeat this time within the courts of what was happening in the streets in front of GCOM or inside of GCOM, and now we have in the Guyana court system? I think this should have been over and done with a long time ago, one way or another. And it looks as though we're in for a long haul here, again with all kinds of stops and starts, and that just does not make us look good. It revives all kinds of old rancor, old acrimonies, and we really need to get past this. We really need to be over with this, if ever we're going to be over with it.
Thank you, Mr. Lal. when you were saying it just now, it reminded me that it's sort of related to what we're talking about with Mr. King just now, that there are certain things that the U.S. used to be able to comment on that they can't really comment on right now. And one of those things being bringing a trial related to the previous election right before the next election. But moving on from that, I'll try to do some a quick wrap up. Right before we close off the program at 9. Now, going over what we've discussed overall about, Venezuela, Maduro seems to try to be holding on for now. It was mentioned by Mr. Lal earlier that the military has proclaimed loyalty to him as of this point. But as you said, that is, for as good, that's as good for it is for, as long as it is, but that can always change. But I would just, ask a final question to our panelists. Where do you think we go from here? And especially in relation to Mr. Maduro's trustworthiness or not. And, do you think that he's been misjudged, even by Guyana in the past, to have, dealt with him and negotiated with him, taking his word for it, but, clearly he's showing himself not to be a man of his word. But, there's always the argument that, you got to negotiate and at least try. But, and also, do you think there's this idea that, you just have to wait him out, but now it's clear that you're not going to be waiting him out. Or I shouldn't say it's clear, but it's likely that you're not going to be fully waiting him out. He's trying to hold on, and you may have to be dealing with him in the future, especially with the Guyana Venezuela Essequibo issue, and that case always well, it's still pending right now in the legal proceedings, but obviously as a controversy, it's been around for Guyana's entire existence, and will probably continue to be around. So I will ask our panel to respond to that, and then we'll go into closing remarks after that. Mr. Jonas, I'll start with you.
I remember an American congressman said, I can't remember his name, that democracy is a terrible system, but it's the best system we've got. And I'm afraid that's where we are. Because one of the problems with democracy is that it's about marketing. It's about sound bites, it's about pretty faces, it's about making memorable, banal, meaningless comments that resonate with a population that probably isn't thinking too deeply about it. And there is not a politician in Venezuela, I'm absolutely certain, opposition or government, who is going to say that Guyana is right, Venezuela is wrong, and we should leave the boundary where it's been for the last 100 years. So I don't think it makes much difference from our point of view in terms of getting a meaningful change in dialogue from Venezuela, who's in power. The Venezuelan children learn in school that Essequibo is theirs, and they believe it as sincerely, as fundamentally as Guyanese children believe that Essequibo is ours. The fact that historically, anyone who looks at it meaningfully will recognize that the arbitration award is binding. It was adhered, it was recognized and confirmed by both sides. That doesn't hold much sway in the marketplace that is the democratic process. So, what does Maduro do if he succeeds in what he's trying to do? He will try to distract attention from the hardship the Venezuelans are suffering and the increased hardship they will suffer with further US sanctions, and from his own disingenuity by refocusing attention on Guyana. Very possible, very likely. Can we do anything about that? No. I agree with what Mr. King is saying, that it is best for the entire region, for countries to have stable democracies so that the people can prosper. I think that we have a more immediate thing that we can learn. The ancient Romans said that the purpose of the study of history is you learn from your mistakes. I think more realistically, you repeat the same mistakes until you get hit in the head so hard that you learn. Our system is the same as Venezuela's electoral system, and the same breach appeared to have happened, which was that the statements of poll were not publicly shown to the people. Now in Venezuela, apparently, they voted in a dual way. So you had an electronic tabulation, but you also had paper ballots. Now, the lesson I would like to ask that we learn is that if there are doubts about the votes, the only way to check those votes is for those physical pieces of paper to be present, those physical paper ballots to be present, so that they could be recounted as we did in 2020. I personally do not have the expertise to go and check and second guess. Some claim that some software was corrupted or some electronic process was compromised in a computerized system. But I can go and count those pieces of paper. And with a population of 700,000, 400,000 votes, I would like to strongly recommend that we learn from that lesson and we maintain the system of paper ballots so that we have the physical evidence there in a form that any child who can count can do a cross-check. The other thing that I really think we need to learn from the process is that the Electoral Council in Venezuela apparently failed in their obligation to make public those statements of poll, those documents that emanated from each place of poll, as they were supposed to do. Similarly with us, I would like to urge that we learn from that lesson. Next year is coming, that a website be made available so that the statement of poll at each place of poll is not just nailed to the door. That only makes it visible to dozens of people. It can be uploaded by the person in charge at each place of poll to a single website available to the entire world, so that every media house, every Guyanese can tabulate step by step as each officer uploads from each place of poll their statement of poll. It's visible to the whole country. I hope those are the two lessons we can take away from our 2020 experience and from Venezuela's 2024 experience. If we don't learn, we will repeat our mistakes.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Mr. Lal?
Listen, I don't think Maduro is going to yield any ground. I think that a lot hinges on how the U.S. reacts to that, what moves its plan A and B it's contemplating. It cannot be a bystander here. I think that everything hinges on this call for transparency. It is beyond me how, in an electoral system, with the turnout that the Venezuelans had, how I go back to these tally sheets, and we're not talking about Florida and hanging chads. We're talking about a national election, and tally sheets from what I understand, every electoral polling station. I think the opposition did a lot of work there. It should be commended for that. If those things can be authenticated as being from that electoral system, then let that transparent count begin and let that result take effect. Now, I am concerned, as I've said before, with all these big powers kind of hovering around, those in the east and those on the west, they're all hovering around. And the stakes are big. In addition to the 300 billion barrels of oil, this is right in America's backyard. This is right in Guyana's backyard. And it does not, I wouldn't feel comfortable with other than the Americans being around here. We've got, I think our choice has been made for us. Our choice was made for us in 2020. And so we're going to have to live with that, whether we like it or not. I think it's in the best interest of the United States not to sit on its hands. The question is, how far if sanctions are going to have to come, because I see Maduro being adamant. So how are you going to give teeth to those sanctions? And what does that mean in terms of the trickle down or the cascade down into Guyana in terms of refugees? Things are hard there. They will only get more distressing. And so more distressing in Caracas and its other outer boroughs means more more of an influx here. In terms of our elections, quite frankly, I don't even want to talk about that. But I think we haven't learned anything from the last elections. We haven't implemented anything that the EU has said. I think it was a 28 page or a 28 point, 31 point recommendation. We haven't implemented what we feel like or what suits us. And so there's a lot of things hanging there. So we're going into an election, and already there are all kinds of back and forth about biometrics and voters list and so on and so forth. So we seem to be bogged down in ancient history. We're not moving forward. And the stakes are high here also in terms of another 5 years. And we've got, at the worst time, perhaps in the best time and the worst time of our existence, we have a Maduro next door. He's not Romulo Betancourt. He's not Carlos Andres Perez. He is Nicolas Maduro. And even in its most benign form, that is not good for us. That is not good for us as Guyana. We are too close to Venezuela. We are here by an accident of geography. We have the accident of geology with our patrimony. And so we're up for grabs. I am glad that the United States is here, or it's very much visible. It's not so audible as it should be. I think, again, Mr. Jonas, you may not like this, and a lot of people may not like this, but all that talk about American base and all that business, it's going to have to come back into the center of the discussion, at least maybe not publicly, but it's gonna have to take place, because this thing is not going to die away. That's happening in Venezuela, and for better or worse, we are going to feel the effects here.
Thank you, Mr. Law. When Mr. Jonas was speaking earlier, something it reminded me of. You were saying that any Venezuelan politician would try to make Essequibo an issue in some way, shape, or form. When you look at the Venezuelan election maps, the results that are claimed and published, I've noticed particularly they're trying to include Essequibo in their maps, and they try to shade it as sort of like no results because disputed, but they try to include it in their maps. So that is something that to take note of. And also, Mr. King mentioned it earlier, but I was thinking of it as the two of you were talking just now. It will be interesting to see in the future if you do have a migrant influx from Venezuela now. Just how much it does impact that Guyana-Venezuela discussion in future. If you do have a lot of Venezuelans now living on the land, in Guyana, we can't see into the future, but that will be something to look at.
Well, before you go to Mr. King, we go back almost 100 years, close to 100 years, and we go back to Czechoslovakia and the Sudetenland, and where we had that big German population, and that served as the launch pad for what took place and led into other things. We are going to have people, Venezuelans, in Essequibo, and we're going to have more of them, and so that's, I think, is something to contemplate for later.
I was going to joke that I've been criticized for comparing Maduro to Saddam Hussein, so I wouldn't even dare compare him to Adolf Hitler. But on that note, I'll move on to Mr. King for his closing remarks.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity tonight. And I did want to briefly agree with Mr. Jonas, agree on the principle of needing paper ballots and a paper trail. There's just too much doubt that people are able to push into any election anywhere in the world. So we've got the same problems here in the United States, and there has to be a clear paper trail so that, if you have a situation where the majority of people don't have faith in the outcome of the election, then your governments aren't legitimate in a democracy. So we need that backup and a good mechanism so that the people who never admit defeat can be shown to be just childish because, hey, we've got the evidence. When Mr. Law is talking about Mr. Maduro not going away on his own, I agree completely. He's 61 years old. He's not that old. He's got a lot of years left to be a pseudo dictator. And I think, generally speaking, history shows us that those people are only forced out when the people rise up enough that the military says, you know what, we're not going to slaughter our own people. You got to go. So, and I think that's the likely end game if there is an end game for Maduro. Otherwise, he's going to hang on just the way Assad has managed to hang on in Syria. So, I know that's not a pleasant thought, but I mean, that is the way it's going to go. But at least, in Syria, people don't stand up the way they did in Venezuela. All these people came out to the polls. They can't give up. They need to continue to be encouraged and to say, we'll strike rather than accept what we're getting, having the election stolen from us. I think that kind of dynamic can push the military to tell Maduro it's time to go. As far as the U.S.'s role, I agree with you that it's important that we have a role and a more active role than either. There are two types of America First people. They're the ones who understand America First being in the greater good, and the ones who just are isolationists, like someone from the 19th century. I think it's important that we get involved and not make the sort of structural or mental model mistakes we made during the Cold War. We need to be standing up for what's right and sticking to that, not just thinking this is in our self-interest now, and we'll work with this bad guy because it's in our interest, and we won't really stand up for our principles. I think as long as we're standing up for the principles in our founding documents that we always say we should share with everyone, then we can, as long as it'll take a while, but we can keep pushing things in the right direction and also build the right kind of lasting relationships. So we've got good partnerships down with Guyana and a future Venezuela, I would hope.
Thank you, Mr. King. And we are going to end the program just now, but I'll just give you the chance to, if you want to remind the audience who you are in relation to your election one last time before we close off.
Thank you. Yes, I'm a Republican and conservative and common sense candidate for Congress here in New York 5, southern half of Queens, which includes Little Guyana.
All right. Thank you to our panelists for tonight's discussion. Thank you to our audience for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed it. And thanks again to our wonderful producer, Devin Bassoon, and also Mr. Nohar Singh, without them, none of this would be possible. Thank you so much once again to everyone.